In 1920, Congress amended the National Defense Act of 1916, putting in place the three-component system of the Army: the Standing Regular Army, the National Guard, and the Organized Reserves. The 1920 National Defense Act also established the Army Air Service, which would transform over the decades to eventually become the Air Force. The act also eliminated the Tank Corps as its own organization, moving it back to the infantry. During the Second World War, America's tanks were designed either to support infantry operations or traditional cavalry operations. They lacked the firepower of German and Russian models, but their reliability, particularly the M4 Sherman tank, and the nation's ability to produce them en masse made them invaluable for infantry support. Major General Adna R. Chaffee, Jr., called the father of the armored force, saw that mechanized infantry would dominate the next major war. In 1931, Army Chief of Staff Douglas MacArthur directed all branches to mechanize, but the process was costly and slow, with many still believing horses were far superior to trucks and tanks. But improvements in vehicle design continued, and as America entered World War II, the horse was replaced by jeeps, motorcycles, tanks, and trucks. U.S. soldiers would also be going to war with improved weapons. The new model 1918 A2 Browning automatic rifle, BAR, was the perfect light machine gun. It no longer featured a semi-automatic firing option. It fired only in full automatic. The M1918 A2 also had a skid-style bipod mounted at the muzzle end of the barrel to improve stability. Two other Browning guns served as the medium and heavy machine guns of World War II. The .30 caliber M19 Browning machine gun was air-cooled with a perforated barrel shroud rather than a water jacket that had been used on an older model. With the .50 caliber M2 Browning machine gun, John Browning completed the trifecta of America's light, medium, and heavy machine guns of World War II. The M2 was similar in design to the M1919, but used the much larger .50 caliber cartridge developed at the same time as the gun. But most infantrymen were not carrying machine guns. During World War II, they were carrying the weapon that General George S. Patton, Jr. called the greatest battle implement ever devised, the M1 Garand. In 1935, MacArthur finished his tour as Army Chief of Staff and became military advisor to the Commonwealth Government of the Philippines. The U.S. had maintained forces in the Philippines since 1898, including a substantial number of Filipino units. Yet only Manila Bay had adequate fortifications. MacArthur was still working for the Philippine government in 1941, organizing the new Philippine Army. With limited resources, the forces were neither as well trained nor as well equipped as he would have liked. In July of '41, President Roosevelt recalled MacArthur to active services in the U.S. Army, making him Lieutenant General and named him Commander of U.S. Armed Forces in the Far East. The Philippine forces were incorporated into the U.S. Army, and MacArthur prepared for invasion from Japan. But an invasion that no one expected to happen did in just a few short months. It was understood at the time that if America entered the war, it would focus the bulk of its resources on defeating Germany first. Forces in the Philippines would be focused on the Bataan Peninsula, with the result of the Philippines reluctantly sacrificed. On December 8th, the Imperial Japanese forces struck the air base on the Philippines. There's been much finger-pointing and blame over the years regarding why the planes were on the ground when word of the bombing at Pearl Harbor had already spread. But regardless of the reasons, the Japanese were able to destroy over half of the Far East Air Force's planes on the first day of the war. With air superiority attained, the Japanese land forces began initial strikes on December 10th and a full-scale invasion on December 22nd. The inadequately trained and poorly equipped Filipino forces were unable to hold the invaders back. Macarthur's troops were forced to defend their shrinking territory on half rations. No help could get through from the U.S. James Cowan, a mechanic with the U.S. Air Corps, wrote later,
"There was no doubt in my mind that Bataan was to be our last battle. With the Japanese virtually in control of the South Pacific, I could see no way we could receive help. The other thing we could do was to fight as long as possible, slowing up the rampaging Japanese on their drive towards the Dutch East Indies. My life with the anti-aircraft company became one constant whirl of action, setting up guns to protect bridges or other strategic points as our troops retreated to Bataan. We seemed to move all night and fire at the Jap planes all day. Our rations became less and less as the weeks passed. We ate all the horses and mules from the 26th Cavalry. Even General Wainwright's companion jumper was sacrificed."
In February 1942, with the Japanese closing in, President Roosevelt ordered Macarthur to escape to Australia. Macarthur at first considered resigning his commission and staying to fight, but his staff talked him out of it. On March 12th, Macarthur and a small group escaped on 4 PT boats. They were picked up by the U.S. Navy and eventually reached Australia. On arriving in Australia, Macarthur made his famous "I shall return" speech.
"The President of the United States ordered me to break through the Japanese lines and proceed from Corregidor to Australia for the purpose, as I understand it, of organizing the American offensive against Japan, a primary objective of which is the relief of the Philippines. I came through and I shall return."
It would take years, but General Macarthur would return, and he would recapture the Philippines. He would also receive the Medal of Honor for his defense of the Philippines. Macarthur was one of many generals who would attain a legendary status during World War II. General George C. Marshall was Army Chief of Staff throughout the war. Though he didn't lead troops into combat, he skillfully managed the largest military expansion in U.S. history, a 40-fold increase in just 3 years. By the end of April 1945, over 3 million U.S. Army soldiers would be fighting in the European theater of operations and 1.2 million in the Pacific theater, where another 1.4 million sailors were also serving. He developed a strategy that would guide Allied operations in Europe, and in December 1944 became the first American general promoted to 5-star rank. General George S. Patton commanded forces in North Africa, Sicily, and the European theater. Following the Normandy invasion in 1944, he was given command of the U.S. Third Army. His temper and speech could get him in trouble, but he was a master of logistics. His planning and audacity helped him lead his force to victory at the Battle of the Bulge. General Omar Bradley was much less colorful than Patton, but he commanded the U.S. First Army on D-Day in the Omaha and Utah beachhead landings and planned Operation Cobra, which allowed the Allies to break out of Normandy and into Brittany. And then there was General Dwight D Eisenhower. In 1942, he was made Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in the North African Theater of Operations. After the collapse of Axis forces in North Africa in 1943, Eisenhower became the Supreme Allied Commander of Allied forces in Europe. Generals Patton, Bradley, and others reported to him as he planned and guided operations to the end of the war. But as critical as the generals are to planning, the wars are won by the soldiers and their frontline officers. Men like Lieutenant Vernon Baker of the 370th Infantry, 92nd Infantry Division, the Buffalo Soldiers. Lieutenant Baker would receive the Medal of Honor for actions taking place near the end of the war, over April 5th and 6th, 1945, near Viareggio, Italy. Lieutenant Baker received the Distinguished Service Cross for actions over those 2 days, presented to him on July 4th, 1945. And over 50 years later, President Clinton presented him with the Medal of Honor. Vernon Baker remained in the Army until 1968. He returned stateside in 1947, where he continued to face racism within and outside of the military. But on July 26, 1948, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, declaring that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. It was only a step, but a large one, on the path to recognizing the contributions that African American soldiers made to the military and to the nation. The Buffalo Soldiers of the 92nd Division had proven, as other African American soldiers had done in every previous war, that honor and courage are not measured in color. The Axis powers surrendered in the summer of 1945, and America was ready to bring the troops home. But veterans were returning home to a grateful nation. The GI Bill in 1944 provided a range of benefits to returning soldiers, including low-cost mortgages, business loans, tuition assistance, and up to a year of unemployment compensation. By 1956, over 2 million veterans had used the GI benefits to go to college or university, and almost 7 million more used the benefits for other training.